Okay, good morning, everybody from the North London Buddhist Centre. This is our regular Saturday morning class, and every month we have a talk on Buddhism. Karuna Gita has been leading our meditation. She's here with me, and Jenny is looking after the tech. My name is Ratnaprabha. I'm a member of the Ratna Buddhist Order, and the chair here at North London Buddhist Centre. And we're just about to start a new series. And the new series will be on the triple training, the three trainings of ethics, meditation, and wisdom, or the training in life, the training in mind, and the training in insight. So today I'm going to give a little bit of an overview, but I want to give an overview with a particular slant, and the slant is towards freedom, because it seems to me that freedom is a very topical subject. It's something which does feel really constrained at the moment. Here we are in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Things are quite serious here in London. A lot of people have been getting very ill. A lot of people are very worried about it. And a lot of people are constrained because of all the precautions. So is there any way that we can actually feel free despite the problems of our external circumstances? So I'm going to have a look at a bit at that in the light of the three trainings. And I'm going to call this talk The Long Walk to Freedom, The Long Walk to Freedom. And this was, as you probably know, the title of Nelson Mandela's autobiography. And for many years, Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island in South Africa. And of course, he describes that long walk, as he calls it, the long process by which he eventually achieved his liberty. But it's my impression that there was a freedom, a sort of a freedom, that Mandela achieved even before he was released, even while he was still imprisoned. His spirit, his will, his mind, they were not held captive. And the thing is that nobody can imprison your mind. You can only imprison your own mind. And that book, The Long Walk to Freedom, describes how he trained himself, and the ways in which his human qualities developed so that he was able to get to that sort of inner freedom. And in a much smaller way, I could much relate to his time on Robben Island, because it felt a bit like what my school days felt like. I used to go to school not all that far from here, in that direction, a school called William Ellis at the bottom of Parliament Hill in Highgate. And I can remember, it was a good school, it was all right, I'm not complaining, but I can remember I was so impatient for the end of my school days. In fact, I deliberately recorded, as it were, a message for my future self, saying, remember, these are not the best days of your life. That myth is wrong. At least it was for me. Don't go around telling people that. And I hope to goodness, I thought at the time, it doesn't get more oppressive than this, because I just felt entrapped. And I can actually remember this quite clearly. I can remember looking around in the playground with its high fences to stop the footballs getting out, and thinking, this is not where I want to be. I want to be able to run my own life. I want to make my own decisions. Adults, I thought, they've got a freedom that school children have not got. And so I longed to be an adult also, in that my life would be free from my parents as well, from my mother. Adults could decide what to do, how to spend their days. They could decide where to go, especially if they had a bit of money. I thought that would be another good thing to have, wouldn't it? So I respect that teenager. I respect that longing. It was a longing for freedom from external control. But it took me a while to realize that there's another kind of freedom. There is a pure feeling of liberation that you can have whatever your external circumstances. And the philosopher Isaiah Berlin called the freedom from external constraints negative freedom. And for him, that was the major issue of modern society, How can you create a society where antisocial behavior is constrained and where the individual will sometimes be forced to serve the common good, but where those external constraints are kept to a minimum, an absolute minimum? So negative freedom is the absence of coercion. The less I'm interfered with by people who've got power over me, the more freedom I have. The public sphere, the government, as we know at the moment, will tend to interfere with that freedom. But other values mean that, that any limitations to freedom should be kept to a minimum. They should just be to do with, say, making sure that the powerful can't exert coercion over the weak and deprive them of their freedom. But Isaiah Berlin also talks about negative freedom. That was negative freedom. He also talks about positive freedom. And that's something quite different. It's self-mastery. It's independent thinking. It's being actively engaged in your own life. It's taking responsibility. And Isaiah Berlin brings in a warning note here. The trouble with the idea of responsibility and self-mastery is that other people can claim that they know them better than you do. And then they say that they're acting on behalf of your better self, they're curbing your lower instincts, and you get oppressive morality coming in from religions and from ideological powers, and you lose your negative freedom in the name of positive freedom. So if you're being frog-marched to heaven by your betters, then you're not really free. So what about Buddhism? The Buddha always described his path as leading to freedom. Freedom is one of the words that he used for the destination, if you want to call it that, of Buddhism. Liberation, emancipation. And there are a number of words in the Buddhist languages for this. And he was particularly concerned, he was concerned with the negative type of freedom, actually. He was particularly concerned with the positive type, but the negative type did interest him. He campaigned against the caste system. He spoke of the evils of poverty. He spoke of the duty of governments to alleviate poverty, to remove oppression, to stop wars and so on. But primarily his teaching was what we'd now call of a spiritual path, a path of positive freedom, which can be achieved even in the face of lacking negative freedom. Now, this talk is an introduction to a series of talks. And if I wanted to be a bit boring, I'd describe the current series as it's on one of those Buddhist lists. It's on the 5 precepts, the basic Buddhist guidelines for how to lead a skillful and happy life. And after that, we'll move on to the phase of meditation, the new mind, and then the phase of wisdom, new insight. And these are what's called the triple training, Firstly, a new life, ethics, then a new mind, meditation, and thirdly, a new insight, wisdom. Now, this triple training is the simplest formulation of the Buddhist path. It's the teaching that the Buddha emphasized very much in the last year of his life. He was 80 years old. He knew he didn't have very long to live. And he wanted to clarify what the Buddhist path was. He wanted to make sure that his legacy was secure, that people would remember what the essentials of the path were. So he did a teaching tour. Very old man, very frail, quite ill at times, but he dragged himself around northern India to literally dozens of places. And he visited as many of his followers as he could. Buddhism was already really thriving before the Buddha died. And over again, he gave a talk. And he gave this talk emphasizing the triple training, giving an account of those days. We've got the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is a long text describing the teachings the Buddha gave and the events that happened in the last year of his life. And I'm going to quote something from that. This is what he says. Well, first of all, the sutta itself has a little poem in it to remind you of what's important. It says, virtue, concentration, wisdom, and emancipation unsurpassed. These are the principles realized by Gautama the Buddha, the renowned. And knowing them, he, the Buddha, to his monks has taught the Dharma. He, the destroyer of suffering, the master, the seer, is at peace. And then quoting the Buddha himself, such and such is virtue, such and such is meditation, such and such is wisdom. Great becomes the fruit, great is the gain of meditation when it's fully developed by virtuous conduct. Great becomes the fruit, great is the gain of wisdom when it's fully developed by concentration. Utterly freed from the taints is the result. Or this is a more Victorian translation of the same bit, starting a bit earlier. Whilst the Buddha stayed there on the Vulture's Peak, he gave a comprehensive religious talk with the monks on the nature of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. Great is the fruit, great the benefit of meditation when it's protected by ethics. Great is the fruit, great is the benefit of wisdom when it's protected by meditation. And the mind, protected by wisdom, is freed from the deep biases. And these biases that it's freed from, by the way, they're called the asavas. They're the bias of self-gratification, the bias of self-making or becoming, and the bias of ignorance. And following the three trainings frees you from these, and that is freedom, that is enlightenment. Now, a lot of you will have heard this way of describing the path, I'm sure. And sometimes we call it the threefold way. But you may not have noticed that little bit at the end, the mention of freedom. In a way, the fourth, or at least the goal of the three trainings. And the Buddha was highlighting how the training ends. What's the culmination of the training? And this is freedom from the deep biases, or it's emancipation. As it says in the poem from the great Death Sutta, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, virtue, concentration, wisdom, and emancipation unsurpassed. These are the principles realized by Gautama the Buddha. And also the Noble Eightfold Path often gets this clarification. After perfect samadhi, the eighth limb of the path, perfect concentration, if you like, or meditation, comes freedom, emancipation. So I want to highlight, in talking of the triple training, I want to highlight in particular that wonderful vision of freedom that it seems to me is so central to Buddhism. After your basic needs are met, your needs, say, for food, for shelter, for love, and so on, you need freedom. Freedom is a basic human need. It's a longing that we've got. And for me, at least, it's a very attractive prospect. It's the culmination of the triple training. But it's not just the ultimate result. It's not just pie in the sky at the end of it all. It's not something that you've got to be patient for. You hope maybe you'll get it before you die, because you're not a prisoner waiting for the days when your sentence ends and at last you'll go out through that big door with a little bit of charcoal, marking the days on your whitewashed wall. How many days left until the end of my sentence? It is not like that. Human life is not a prison. Freedom is said to be the flavor of the whole path. And the Buddha said, the Dharma, that is the path, and the discipline that I teach has one flavor, the flavor of freedom or of release. That's from the Udana. Anyway, before I explain how freedom is the flavor of each of the three parts of the triple training, I'll just say a little bit more to clarify what those three trainings are actually pointing to. The old Sanskrit terms for the three are Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. And they're trainings, they're ways of guiding your life that you can learn, that you can practice, that you can perfect. I love this actually. Buddhism isn't about being a good person. It's not even about being an enlightened person. It's about training. In other words, it's about putting energy into certain aspects of your life and into certain mental states, and doing that consistently, as best you can, patiently, over a long period, a long walk to freedom. And sometimes failing pretty badly to do that. But that's normal. That is fine. You persist. So a new life, the three trainings, a new mind and new insight. And the new life is Shila, or the Pali is Sila. You gradually come to realize that if you have skillful intentions, if you act or speak from those intentions, then you can make a really positive difference in the world, and you can also find happiness for yourself as well. To give a very trivial example of this, a few weeks ago, Christmas card time came round again, yet again, another year, Christmas card time. Now, I don't really observe Christmas, apart from treating myself to a small pudding during my solitary retreat. That was the end of my celebration. So my card sending has really dwindled over the years. And I was just sort of getting it out of the way, a little list of relatives and non-Buddhist acquaintances and friends. But then I thought, actually, that is a nice thing to do, isn't it? To choose a card, to write a message, to send it off, to think of an old friend. And I felt a bit ashamed of myself for my meanness. And so I did write down a list of people, distant people who I love, who I used to love, connections I really value. And I'm so glad I did that. For me, it gave me a great sense of uplift. And I also had some good, nice responses from them as well. So there's a little equation that explains Shila, the first training. Skillful intentions plus skillful actions equals happiness all around. Skillful intentions, skillful actions equals happiness all around. But if you have unskillful intentions, the opposite is the case. You cause hassle and trouble to others. You'll feel anxious. You'll even feel miserable yourself in the long term. Skillful intentions are states of mind that open you up, that relax you, that displace the unskillful intentions of fear, of tight selfishness, of narrow-mindedness. And the Buddha suggested various ways of behaving and speaking that would follow naturally from skillful intentions. And the best known of these is the list of the 5 precepts. And that's what our series is going to be on. And I'll tell you what that list is in case you're not familiar with it in a few minutes. So we're going to have a talk on each of these precepts. And I want to tell you this today, how they relate in particular to freedom, because it's a bit of a paradox there, because precepts, list, it sounds like rules. It sounds like, well, in fact, the Buddha said that the precepts are based on self-restraint. So how could that be liberating? Now, the second training, the new mind, is samadhi, meditation or concentration. And here, samadhi means the whole field of directly working on our states of mind. And seated meditation practice is a particularly helpful and a particularly fruitful way of doing that. For example, in the meditation of universal friendliness, you find a little ember of kind and loving emotion deep down, and then you open your mind to encompass an awareness of everybody around you, and you send that warm friendliness outwards in every direction, tapping into a genuine wish for the happiness of other people. It's rather lovely. Yet, meditating like that, or any kind of meditation, also seems a bit like a restraint in the way, a discipline. Why just sit there getting bored? Why not just do what you feel like at the time? And then the third training, the new insight, the third training is prajna, deep understanding or wisdom. Is that limiting too, do you think? Would it be easier to be blissfully ignorant? Well, whenever you can open to your experience as it is, dropping neediness, dropping self-clinging, then you've touched on prajna. And then you're completely in tune with life as an ever-changing flow, as impermanence. Now, maybe the answer to this issue, are the 3 trainings freedom or are they constriction, is to look at the way they interact with each other and how they form a spiral. You can link the 3 trainings together. And that shows, I think, that they're not really limitations on acting freely, on feeling free. So once you have a glimpse of the third one, once you have a glimpse of insight, you look once again at the first one, at the way you live your life. If you're less self-obsessed, you can live more skillfully, quite naturally. And it becomes a natural thing you just want to do. And living skillfully gradually liberates your states of mind. And dwelling in skillful states of mind is the second of the trainings, meditation. And those skillful states of mind are naturally more open, they're naturally less self-protective, and so new flashes of insight can emerge. And in this way, you can go through the whole triple training over and over again, each training feeding into and enhancing the other ones in what's sometimes called a spiral path. And at each turn of the spiral, it's wider. In other words, the experience is one of opening, of widening, of liberation, of positive freedom. Okay, so what are the 5 precepts? Shila means the way of living that naturally emerges from dwelling in skillful states of mind. But it also means something else. It also means the discipline, so to speak. It means the discipline to act and to talk as if your mind was skillful. So the precepts are meant to be a model of how a skillful person would live, a model provided by the Buddha, who we think is a reliable guide as to what a skillful person would do. So here are the 5 precepts. And this is translated from the standard version that you will find recited in some way or another in pretty much all Buddhist communities throughout the world. It's something that really unites Buddhists together. Precept 1 is the kindness precept. And here's my translation of it. I undertake the footprint of training, or the footstep of training, to abstain from harming living beings. Precept 2 is the one of open-handedness. I undertake the footprint of training to abstain from taking what is not given. Precept 3 is contentment and non-exploitation. I undertake the footprint of training to abstain from wrong conduct for one's own gratification, or literally in regard to sense pleasures, but conventionally it's especially said to refer to unethical sexual behavior. The 4th precept is the precept of integrity. I undertake the footprint of training to abstain from communicating falsehood. And then the 5th precept is the precept of awareness and non-addiction. I undertake the footprint of training to abstain from using substances that give rise to unawareness or carelessness. And the Buddha also provides more upbeat advice for each precept rather than what you don't do, what you avoid doing. He does talk about what you actually do or say. And for some reason, these positive versions of the precepts that were taught originally by the Buddha are not normally chanted. But in our own community, there is a little recitation based on them that we do. With deeds of loving kindness, I purify my body. That's the 1st precept. With open-handed generosity, I purify my body. With stillness, simplicity, and contentment, I purify my body. With truthful communication, I purify my speech. With mindfulness, clear and radiant, I purify my mind. So you're basing your actions on kindness and generosity, you're living simply and contentedly, you're discovering and conveying the truth as much as possible, and you're cultivating mindfulness and awareness. So how do these precepts, how does this first training relate to freedom? Well, you can probably see that each of those precepts opens up a rich world of possibilities and also puzzles and debates and so on. So do come along to the talk on each one if they intrigued you in any way. Today I want to home in on whether behaving yourself, as it were, can ever feel liberating. When I was a child, that was the last thing I wanted to hear. Is following the precepts freedom? Well, the thing is, why is it that sometimes we are horrible to people? Why is it sometimes we deceive for our own ends? Why is it sometimes we get pissed and do things that we regret and all those kind of things? What is it that motivates us when we're unskillful? That's a very big question, and I don't know if there's only one answer to it. There probably isn't. But often these are behaviors that have simply become habitual. It's the easiest thing to do, especially when life is tough and we feel that we need to protect ourselves and we need to protect our interests. Then we'll fall back on those unskillful habits. So we've got destructive habits. I'm sure we all have. And being habits, we will almost certainly do them again. You just can't, unless you're very unusual, you can't just turn off a habit. But the really optimistic and liberating thing about the Buddhist approach is that it says that choices here are available. In this area, choices are available. Every moment brings a possibility of opening up, of freeing our minds a bit, or of closing down a bit, of tightening and going into our shell. You do have that choice. Something opens up, especially with mindfulness. Mindfulness, the purpose of mindfulness from a Buddhist point of view is not just to make you more relaxed and to deal with stress, it's to open a space where you can actually look at what you're saying, what you're doing, how you're living, even where your mind is going. And you can say, well, there's enough space for me here to say, no, let's watch this one. What will happen if I go down that one? Oh, what will happen if I go down that one? And you can, no, I think I'll go for that one. Not always, but sometimes you can do that. So this is our choice. What are we going to choose? Are we going to choose opening or closing? Are we going to choose freedom, or are we going to choose the endless round of habit, which is known as samsara in Buddhism? So there is loads of chance to practice the new life of Buddhist ethics, and that's where the freedom is. It's the freedom to choose, the freedom to make our own decisions on how to live. And this freedom is actually threatened by our habits. Our habits are unfree. And if circumstances are difficult, the habits will be stronger. They'll impose themselves more. But that's okay. That's what human life is about. Nobody said it was going to be a bowl of cherries. There is another issue that comes in here, and I don't want to get too philosophical, but it's the issue of that obsesses Western philosophy, the issue of free will. There's quite a strong prevalent view, which I think is derived from misunderstandings of the science of the brain. And this view says that really we don't have any choices, that really once you've entered a program into your little supercomputer up here, there's only one outcome, or if there is more than one outcome, it's all determined by outside influences or random processes. Well, I'm not going to get into that. We could have a whole talk on that, no doubt, but just ask yourself, do you actually feel as if you have no choice at all? But if you feel you do have some freedom, then live as if you do. You can worry about the philosophy later, but the feeling is, yes, I can make a decision. So let's live like that. And then you'll have a much better life. So let's look specifically at the precepts and how they relate to freedom. What you could say for the first precept is love is liberation and hatred is bondage. Love is liberation, hatred is bondage. That's all I'm going to say. I'm just going to say one or two words for each precept because time is getting on. The second precept brings out the liberating feeling of liberality. Wonderful word, isn't it? Liberality, giving. The third precept shows how sexual and romantic obsession is oppressive. It oppresses oneself as well as exploiting the person that you're obsessed with. Now imagine having the freedom of not feeling desperate to bring every encounter with an attractive person to the culmination that you desire. It might be for you a distant memory, but can you recall that desperation of that longing? But imagine being free to treat everybody as a human being, not having to flick them into the twin boxes. This one is desirable. Oh no, that one's undesirable, desirable, undesirable. And then, start getting obsessed with the ones in the desirable box, finding the right one. The fourth precept shows that lying entraps you, but truth is straightforward. Imagine the freedom of never having to dissimulate, of being able to be yourself, to be open. And the fifth precept shows how awareness or mindfulness itself is freedom. But we tend to be easily captured by our need for stimulation or our need for escapism, avoiding the discomfort of the moment, or our need for oblivion, but open into mindfulness. And that itself is freedom. But still, we have this thing that the precepts are a restraint. They're promising to do this and not to do that. And the Buddha used the word restraint when he talked of practicing Shila. You're restraining yourself sometimes from following your impulses, from doing what you feel like. And I think for a lot of people, freedom means just being able to do whatever you feel like. Well, if the Buddha is right, the ethical restraint he advises in the precepts is necessary. You need to get to a place of freedom in which you're no longer governed by your immediate inclinations, by your immediate urges. They are not freedom, following your immediate inclinations. However, in my experience, being skillful is very liberating from the start. We all know how to do it. We do it a lot, being skillful. We know about it. And the reason we tend to be unskillful is, yes, it's because of habits, as I said earlier, and we give way to those habits because we're burdened by oppressions. And I love this little list from the Sutra of Golden Light of the things that oppress us. The oppression of existence, the oppression of foolish thought, the oppression of birth and bodily activity, the oppression of the world, the oppression of the fleeting mind, the oppression of impurities caused by the foolish, the oppression of the arrival of evil friends, the oppressions of fear and passion, hatred, folly and darkness, the oppression of the instant, the oppression of gaining merits, in other words, of trying to be good. So I remember it coming as an incredible relief when I realized that I don't actually have to feel oppressed. That's also an area of choice. Even if somebody else seems to be vile and unbearable, even if they're restricting my negative freedom in some way, my mind is my own. That's what Nelson Mandela realized on Robben Island. I can tell you it is possible. And I think it's just worth thinking of your life at the moment. What in your life feels oppressive, if anything? What is there that feels oppressive? And I'm genuinely convinced that you don't have to feel oppressed. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So being in unskillfulness, being in strange and selfish frames of mind is itself an oppression. It's unpleasant. And so the first training is about freedom from bondage, bondage by those unskillful states, and all the things that go wrong when you indulge them. And in the bondage of your own preferences, of your own likes and dislikes, being under the dictatorship of your preferences, allowing yourself to feel oppressed, believing that your habits compel you and that you have no choice. Yuck. That is what it is possible to overcome. So you develop the freedom of a clear conscience in an open heart. Instead of self-concern, you have the freedom to benefit others as well. So I'm going to be briefer, time is going on meditation and insight. The second training is samadhi, meditation, or the cultivation of a new mind by working directly on your mental states. So sitting there all alone, doing nothing except your own thoughts and your feelings, does that sound like freedom? And it seems more on the surface like a sort of a lockdown, a sort of a self-isolation. And in fact, when my partner gets back from South Africa, if she manages to get back, she's going to have to isolate, self-isolate for 10 days, not seeing people, not even going for a walk along the canal. And when you meditate, it can seem a bit like that, as if you're closing down even more than that. You haven't got Netflix when you're meditating. You haven't got social media. You haven't got any podcasts to alleviate that isolation. But all I can say is it actually is not like that. It's not like that. Meditation is sense restraint. It's cutting down on sensory stimulation. That's what it's based on. It's inactivity. You're still, you're not doing things, you're not saying things, but this is actually wonderful and very liberating. And when I'm sitting here in the North London Buddhist Centre teaching meditation classes, I usually try to convince people that meditation is a holiday. It's not a duty. It's a break from all your duties and expectations, being able simply to do nothing. And when it goes well, meditation is a freedom from mental chatter, from those pesky, pestering anxieties and regrets and planning and rehearsing conversations that goes on so much of the time in our minds. And when we're meditating, our habits, our mental habits, seem even more obvious than when we're just living our life. So you will sometimes get worry and distractions and little obsessions and compulsive trains of thought. But imagine freedom from that. And you need the discipline of the meditation, just doing it, preferably every day, and gradually you free from those things. Gently you come back to the object of the meditation over and over again. And it's also a source of very nourishing satisfaction and delight, where you're free from the excessive pulls to gratification, to stimulation, to achievements, to status and recognition. What a relief it is not to have to worry about those things. In fact, the Buddha calls certain forms of meditation, he calls them the liberation of the heart, citta vimuksha, especially the universal friendliness meditation I described earlier. Now, the third training is wisdom, insight. It's seeing things as they are, which might not seem so welcome at first sight, once again, might even seem like a constraint, because instead of thinking of whatever you like, interpreting the world in the way that suits you, you start to be constrained by reality itself. And I was thinking this morning, in the morning, when I go to the bathroom and have a shave, that mirror is ruthless, unforgiving. And year by year, I can see how my face is sagging, my skin is getting dry, the eyes are losing their clarity, the hair is losing its luster and its color. But there is a compensation with aging, a mercy, which is declining eyesight. So although my image is getting older, it's also getting fuzzier and less distinct. So what this shows is, in a way, I'd rather not know what I really look like. Well, maybe appearance, maybe the stark truth of appearance doesn't matter all that much anyway. But let's not hide from reality. Like it or not, with glimpses of insight, you see that the whole of your life's experience is impermanent. So you can't hold on to anything. And then you see that if you do start to hold on to things, suffering will follow you. You can't even hold on to your own identity, your story of yourself, the I that you've been defending for all these years. So is it better to be realistic about those truths or to be unrealistic? Is ignorance bliss? Would you be more free if you could blithely carry on ignoring the truth, ignoring what's really going on? Well, of course, the problem is that in the long run, you can't ignore the consequences of pretending that things are other than they are. Things will go wrong if you do that. Unfortunately, the reports from all the great Buddhist realized beings is that insight itself is incredibly liberating. I'll tell you briefly why it's liberating. There are three big things that insight notices, which I've already hinted at: impermanence, the suffering that comes from clinging, and how the separate self that we protect is actually a fiction. And according to Buddhism, out of all those, there opens a door to liberation, a way through to freedom, if you look deeply into each of those things. From impermanence comes the no labels doorway to freedom, where you allow everything to be as it is without insisting on pinning it down. And the no labeling gateway to liberation comes from impermanence. And then insight into the impermanence helps us to drop that labeling, and we become free from the oppressions of impermanence, the dread of death and the anxiety about what we might lose. And we realize that every loss is accompanied by a gain. Arising and ceasing are artifacts of our attempts to tie things down. And then seeing through the fact of suffering that comes from clinging leads to another doorway of liberation, which is called the no pulls doorway, sometimes called the directionless, because you're not insisting that everything is nice and everything has to work for you. You can remain equanimous on whatever arises, whether it's welcome or not. You're not constantly being pulled towards what you like and pushed away from what you don't like. Oh, we've run out of coffee. That's okay. Have a cup of tea instead. That's all right. You can let go of your preferences, your expectations, and that is freedom. Then the third doorway is the openness doorway, shunyata. At last, you're free of the tyranny of your own ego. You're free of self-concern and of self-clinging. Imagine being relaxed in not knowing who you really are, and just sitting in that wonder, surrounded by the mysteries of reality. Okay, so I'm going to try and conclude now. When I was at school, sitting in my place in those rows of desks with the chalk of the maths teacher squeaking on the blackboard, I felt as if I was in prison. I longed for freedom. But I didn't realize until much later that already, even then, my mind was free, or it could be free. Whether or not my external circumstances of those walls of the school were constraining me, my mind always had access to amazing vistas, wide vistas of love and of joy and of clarity. In fact, that is what minds are made of. They're made of love, joy, clarity, and so on. All minds are made of that. Now, I've not said much about our current prison, this COVID pandemic. What do you think? Is it really a prison? I don't want to underplay it by any means. It's very serious. And on the surface, there seem to be a lot of limitations as we sit here in London in the lockdown. And maybe when we look within, the constraints, the restraints, the constrictions that we have imposed within ourselves are even stronger than that. Anxiety about catching the virus, resentment perhaps, or self-pity perhaps, worry that those we love will get it and we'll lose them, the oppressions of the restrictions on our behavior. I don't want to minimize them, they're very genuine. And I'm sure we all have a story that we can tell. And I would give one little piece of advice, which is to share your story. Just talk about what it's been like for you. Find somebody you can talk to and listen as well. Listen to them. But there may be more liberative ways of viewing our situation. For example, my poor sister loves to celebrate Christmas and the New Year with parties and celebrations and drinking and fireworks and everything. And she was both depressed and angry by being stuck on her own, not able to do any of the partying that she loves. But in contrast, I'd already decided to have a solitary retreat. So I just had my own company as she did. We were both in exactly the same situation in a way. But I suppose in my case, it was a free decision that I'd made. It wasn't something imposed on me, that solitude. But it is true, though, that within the pandemic, within the restrictions, we do have a chance to be quieter. We do have a chance to open up spaces where we are less driven, we're less busy, at least most of us do. I mean, of course, those of us in frontline positions probably are even busier. And maybe there, in those spaces, we can discover the freedom of the triple training, the new life of the precepts, basing your actions on kindness and generosity, living simply and contentedly, discovering and conveying the truth as much as possible, cultivating mindfulness and awareness, and the new mind that can emerge in meditation, and the new insights that dawn on us as we sit quietly, open to the reality of what's here, whether it's welcome or unwelcome. If you train in the new life, in the new mind, in the new insight, liberation is the outcome. It's a long walk, but it's a long walk to freedom. Thank you very much.